My brother told the family group chat the lake house was fully booked for the summer. The same week I discovered, by accident, that he'd blocked every single weekend on the shared calendar under his own name, without a single night actually spent there. This is Still Waters. Here's what he wrote. I'm Wyatt, 37. My parents left the lake house to the three of us equally when they passed. My sister Lena, my brother Roman, and me. A 4-bedroom place on Cattail Lake that's been in the family since before I was born. No formal ownership structure beyond the will itself, just an understanding that we'd share it, coordinate around a shared calendar, split the property tax and maintenance 3 ways. For the first 2 years after Dad died, that mostly worked in the loose, imperfect way family arrangements without paperwork usually do. Dad built most of that house himself over 2 summers in the early 90s, with help from his brother and a couple of neighbors who owed him favors. Every one of us has a specific memory tied to some physical piece of it. The dock he rebuilt after a storm took out the old one. The fireplace mantle he carved our initials into the year I turned 10. The exact creak of the 3rd porch step that none of us have ever wanted fixed because it sounds like walking up to see him. That history is part of why none of us wanted to formalize anything with lawyers or ownership percentages after he died. It felt like reducing something sacred to paperwork, which is a little ironic given where this story ends up. It started shifting the summer Roman got laid off and had more free time than either Lena or me. He began booking weekends further and further in advance. Nothing wrong with that on its own. First come, first served was always the informal rule. But by the second summer, I noticed the calendar had entire months blocked under his name. Not as actual stays, just as holds. TBD, written in the notes. Weekends he'd claim, and then not show up for. While Lena and I found ourselves locked out of dates we'd wanted for our own families. My own kids are old enough now to ask, every June, whether we're going to the lake house that summer. A question I dreaded answering honestly for 2 years running, because the honest answer kept being some version of, I don't know yet. It depends on Uncle Roman's schedule. Which isn't a sentence a 9-year-old should have to hear about a house her own grandfather built. I let it go longer than I should have, mostly because Roman had a rough couple of years. The layoff, a divorce, and it felt petty to fight him over lake house weekends while he was struggling with bigger things. Lena felt the same for a while. But by the 3rd summer, the pattern was undeniable. Roman had the calendar blocked from Memorial Day through Labor Day, every single weekend, under his name. And when I actually checked the property's smart lock entry log, something I only did because the water heater broke and I needed to know who'd last been there to ask about it, the lock had only registered 6 separate stays across the entire summer. He was holding every weekend and using less than a quarter of them. The water heater problem itself took 3 days to resolve because nobody could figure out who'd last used the place, whether it had been running hot the whole time or just recently started failing, and Roman didn't answer his phone for most of that stretch, which felt strange for someone who'd supposedly had the house booked solid the entire month. That gap between booked and actually there was the first concrete thread that made me start looking closer, instead of just feeling generally frustrated. I ended up driving out myself to deal with the plumber, an hour and a half each way, on a weekend that was technically Roman's according to the calendar. The house was empty when I arrived. No car in the driveway. No sign anyone had been there in days. Dust actually visible on the kitchen counter, in a way that doesn't happen after a recent stay. I remember standing in that kitchen, plumber working in the basement below me, feeling a specific kind of anger I hadn't expected. Not at the empty house itself, but at every weekend over the past 2 summers, I'd been told, apologetically, that a date wasn't available, while apparently this is what unavailable had actually looked like the whole time. The group chat message was the thing that actually moved me from irritated to done. Lena had asked reasonably if any July weekend was open for her daughter's birthday. Roman replied that the house was fully booked for the summer, with a shrug emoji, as if the calendar reflected real demand rather than his own blocks. Lena believed him. I almost did too, until the water heater situation had already put me inside that entry log 2 weeks earlier, and I knew exactly how untrue that sentence was. I didn't say anything in the group chat. I pulled the entry log properly this time. The lake house has a keypad system that logs every entry with a timestamp, something Dad installed years ago, mostly for insurance purposes, never intended as anything else. I cross-referenced 3 months of calendar blocks against 3 months of actual entries. Roman had blocked 11 weekends. He'd used 3 of them. The other 8 sat empty, reserved under his name, while Lena and I had been told, repeatedly, that nothing was available. I called Lena before I said anything to Roman, mostly because I wanted to know I wasn't overreacting before I brought it to him. She wasn't surprised exactly. She said she'd had a feeling for a while that the calendar didn't match how often anyone actually saw him post pictures from the lake. But seeing the actual numbers next to each other still landed differently than a feeling had. Lena pulled up her own record of every time she'd asked Roman for a specific weekend over those 2 summers and gotten turned down. 14 requests, all told. Every single one met with some version of already booked or let me check and get back to you, followed, in most cases, by silence until the date had passed. Of those 14, the entry log showed the house sitting empty for 11 of them. Lena's youngest, Mia, actually asked her once, the summer before last, why they never went to the lake house anymore, and Lena told me she hadn't had a good answer that didn't involve criticizing her uncle in front of an 8-year-old. So she just said, maybe next year, and let it go. The same soft deflection she'd been giving Mia for 2 summers running. Hearing her repeat that exchange out loud, on the phone with me, was the moment her frustration stopped being background noise and became something she was ready to actually act on alongside me. We spent that evening building out a full picture together, cross-referencing 3 summers of calendar entries against 3 summers of entry logs, splitting the work by year, so neither of us had to sit with the whole ugly total alone. By the time we finished, the pattern across all 3 years was worse than either of us had guessed from a single summer. Roman had held roughly 70% of all available weekends across 3 years combined, and used barely a quarter of what he'd held, while Lena and I had split the remaining 30% between 2 families and 4 kids who all wanted their own turns. I went to Roman directly, not in the group chat, with the entry log and the calendar side by side. I asked him plainly why he was holding 8 weekends he never used, while telling his sister the house was unavailable for her daughter's birthday. He didn't have a clean answer at first. He said something about wanting the option, about not knowing his schedule far enough in advance to commit or release dates, which might even have been true as a feeling, but didn't explain telling Lena the house was fully booked when it demonstrably wasn't. I laid the 3-year totals in front of him, the way Lena and I had built them out the night before, and watched something shift in his face as he actually looked at the numbers instead of hearing a general accusation he could wave off. 70% held, barely a quarter used. Even he seemed surprised by how stark it looked written down, separate from however he'd been experiencing his own choices week to week. I think that's part of what habits like this do to a person. Each individual hold felt reasonable in the moment it was made, and it was only the accumulated total, laid out plainly, that made the actual shape of it impossible to argue with. He tried briefly to explain that some of the empty weekends were ones where he genuinely intended to go, and then something came up. Work, his kids' activities during his custody weekends, once a minor car repair that ate an entire Saturday. I told him I believed some of those individual explanations were probably true. What I didn't believe was that 8 separate last-minute cancellations over one summer alone all happened to be genuine emergencies, rather than a comfortable habit of holding dates he never seriously intended to firmly commit to. Then he said the thing that actually explained it. If I let go of a weekend, and then things change and I want it, I lose it. It's easier to just hold everything and figure it out later. Easier for him, at the direct cost of Lena and me, never being able to plan anything more than a week or two out, because the calendar always showed full even when the house sat empty. I asked him directly whether he understood that easier for me had meant, in practice, that his sister's daughter hadn't had a lake house birthday in 3 years, and that my own kids had stopped asking to go because the answer was always some version of no. He got defensive there, said I was making him sound like a villain for going through a hard couple of years, and I told him I wasn't calling him a villain. I was telling him what the actual cost of his coping mechanism had been for 2 other families who had just as much claim to that house as he did. I told him I understood the layoff, and the divorce had made this a hard stretch, and that wasn't a dig. It was true, and I meant it. But 3 people owned that house equally, and one person quietly treating equally as whoever grabs it first and holds longest wasn't sustainable, no matter what he was going through personally. We didn't take this to a lawyer, though Lena floated it once, mostly out of frustration rather than real intent. What we did instead was build an actual system, something Dad's generation never bothered with, because they assumed goodwill would always be enough. Each of the 3 of us gets a fixed allotment of weekends per season, claim no more than 8 weeks in advance, with any block that isn't confirmed with an actual booked date, not a TBD, released automatically after 2 weeks. The smart lock log became an explicit part of the agreement too. If a held weekend shows 0 entries, it opens back up for the others. Roman resisted the automatic release rule hardest, which told me it was probably the most necessary one. He came around after Lena, calmly, pointed out that the alternative was formal partition through the courts, splitting or forcing a sale of a house none of us actually wanted to lose, just to settle something a shared calendar with real rules could handle instead. We also agreed, almost as an afterthought that turned out to matter a great deal, to split the maintenance costs strictly by nights actually used, rather than equally 3 ways by default. A change that meant Roman, once his usage dropped to what he actually needed instead of what he'd been hoarding, ended up paying less for the summer than he had the year before, which took some of the sting out of losing the unlimited hold he'd gotten used to. Lena pushed for one more provision that Roman and I hadn't thought to include, a standing agreement that any of the 3 of us could request an audit of the entry log at any time. No explanation required, rather than needing to have a specific suspicion, first, the way she and I effectively did before either of us felt comfortable checking. She said, and I agreed, that the whole situation had only escalated as far as it did because checking felt like an accusation in itself, something you needed a real reason to justify. Making it a standing, ordinary right removed that barrier for good. Getting Roman to actually sign off on the new system took a second, harder conversation about 2 weeks after the first one, once the immediate discomfort of being confronted had worn off and a quieter defensiveness had set back in. He pushed back specifically on the idea that Lena would now have equal visibility into his usage, saying it felt like being surveilled by his own siblings. I told him that framing left out the 7 years the rest of us had spent trusting a system that only worked because nobody was checking. Visibility wasn't a punishment. It was just what shared ownership was supposed to have looked like from the very beginning, before any of us assumed goodwill alone would hold it together indefinitely. This summer, for the first time in 3 years, Lena's daughter had her birthday at the lake house, first weekend in July, booked 6 weeks out with no fight about it. Romans used his allotment more intentionally too. Actual stays instead of holds. I think, without the option to hoard, he started using what he had instead of just guarding it. He brought his new girlfriend, Talia, up for a long weekend in August, the first time he'd introduced anyone to the family at the lake house since the divorce. And it struck me watching him there, actually present instead of just present on the calendar, that some of what had looked like territorial hoarding earlier might have genuinely been about control during a stretch of his life, where almost nothing else felt controllable. That doesn't erase what it cost Lena and me, but it did change how I think about him now. Less as someone who'd decided to be selfish, and more as someone who'd found one lever he could pull when everything else felt like it was pulling itself. I don't think Roman set out to monopolize the place. I think a hard couple of years made him want to hold on to the one thing that still felt stable. And holding on to weekends he never used was the version of control he could reach for at the time. Understanding that didn't mean Lena and I should keep losing our own summers to it. Lena and I still check the entry log occasionally, not out of suspicion anymore, more out of habit at this point. And it's become something almost funny between the three of us now. Roman jokes that he's under permanent audit, and we let him joke about it, because the numbers finally add up the way they were always supposed to. Dad built that house, so all three of us would have somewhere to bring our kids every summer. Not so one of us would end up guarding a calendar nobody else could actually use. Mia had her lake house weekend again, this past July, 2nd year running, and asked Lena, casually, packing the car, whether they could come every summer now. Lena told her yes, actually meaning it this time, and I think that's the real measure of whether any of this worked. Not the spreadsheet, not the new rules on paper, just a kid getting a straight, true answer to a simple question about a house that belongs to all of us equally, the way it always should have. Talia told me quietly, that weekend, that Roman had mentioned the whole ordeal to her early on, before things got serious between them, describing it as the moment he realized he'd been managing his fear instead of managing his actual life. I don't know if that's the full truth of it, or a kinder version he's settled on for himself, but either way, he's shown up more since then, at the lake house and elsewhere, than the version of him holding 8 empty weekends ever did. So here's what I keep wondering. How much of what looks like hoarding is really just someone else's fear wearing a calendar block as a disguise? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. That's the whole story. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Still Waters. Thanks for listening.